No, thank you, Carol. Thanks for that lovely welcome. And it's so nice to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone on Zoom. People on Zoom, I tend to walk around a lot, so I'm going to try really hard to stand here in front of the computer just for you so you can see me. And I also want to say I'm pretty thrilled that I have the true Californian bat royalty here tonight, Pat and Bill. Thank you for coming. They're going to cough if I say anything incorrect and also take the trickier questions for me. Thank goodness. All right, so I did want to start by changing the slide. It's a good skill to have for a public speaker. Here we go. I did want to start by saying that I'm really grateful to be on the ancestral land of the Northern Peyote tribes and to acknowledge and celebrate the current and future elders of these tribes that are keeping their culture strong. And so I'm Rachel. I'm originally from, any guesses? Yeah. Hey, yes, that's right, Southern Texas. No, yes, Australia. And I'm very lucky to have worked all over the world in a range of different biomes with an even broader range of different cool taxa. And luckily for me, Cal Poly Pomona advertised a job that was just wide enough to encompass my research interests, Assistant Professor of Global Change Biology, which I've just started 6 months ago, and I'm really, really excited to be there. So broadly, thank you. Broadly, my interests are how we can conserve biodiversity into a future with such dynamic disturbances as fire, flood, drought, and of course human disturbances like urbanisation and agriculture. Now, I do work on a range of things, but there are some organisms that are very close to my heart, and bats are certainly that group. And if you could have a favourite disturbance, then, I guess I would probably say fire, right? So let's go ahead and talk along those lines. So here is our plan for today. Now, I thought I'd better start today to make sure that everyone is recruited to Team Bat. And what that means is pledging your eternal love and admiration for bats as the greatest group of animals there are, right? So I know there are at least two people, okay? At least two people. Who else is Team Bat? Okay, good. All right, so I'm glad that we have a lot of Team Bat, but it seems like there are a couple of skeptics, so we're just going to have to go through and bring them along. So why are bats so awesome? Okay, so first of all, they have, and many of you will know this already, they have an incredible way of perceiving the world through sound. So they use echolocation, they use high-frequency calls, they're constantly calling as they're flying around to both navigate as well as locate prey as small as a mosquito. Now you might say, okay, well that's cool, but aren't there all these other things that use echolocation? What's so great about that? Well, bats have the most sophisticated echolocation around. It is incredibly nuanced, and different bat species have evolved different echolocation calls with appropriate frequencies and harmonics that will allow them to fit a wide range of niches. So which one of these calls do you think is the bat echolocation call? So these are all echolocating animals here. Which one do you reckon? You can't answer. Yeah. Okay, Micah. The first one. So, sorry, Zoom, I'll be back. So this one here. Yeah, any other guesses? The next one? Correct. Correct. So it's the next one. So this, you can see that it is a very structured call, right? So let's just show you who we have on these different echolocation calls. Some of you may recognise this human as one of the former speakers. So you can see humans can echolocate too, but we have these very rudimentary calls. And even fruit bats, pteropodid bats, there's a type of fruit bat in Egypt, Egyptian fruit bat, who use caves that are very dark, so they've separately evolved a form of echolocation. but they don't have this incredibly sophisticated echolocation call as these insect-eating bats. And just to give you an idea about what's happening here, we're looking at a sonogram or a bunch of sonograms next to each other. On the y-axis, we have kilohertz, which is call frequency. And if you think about us as humans, we'd be really lucky if we can hear up to 15, 20 kilohertz. So really low on this axis. Now, why else are bats awesome? They're very diverse, right? They're extremely diverse. In fact, the only group of mammals more diverse than bats are rodents. But when we say they're more diverse than bats, there are more species, right? But they're species that look like that. They're sort of brown, fluffy, small, normal sort of ears. Okay, they're a little bit more diverse than that, but we're just going to gloss over it. So, but if we look over here on the other side, what do you see? What do you see? You see fluffy shoulders that release scent. You see a variety of ridiculously sized ears. You see fluorescent orange and grabs fish with its feet. You see giant stabby nose. Like, there is so much diversity in bats. So I think that we can agree that bats are, okay, that's a mouse. If you can't see, it's a little dark. The bats are indeed better than rodents. And another reason to join Team Bat is that bats are the only mammal that can fly. So there are other mammals, in Australia, and over here we've got the flying squirrel, we've got the gliders, and they can jump a really long way, and that's great. But can they swoop down and grab a scorpion from the ground? No. Can they pluck a spider from a web? No. But I will say, just a public service announcement from the golden-tipped bat down the bottom that plucks spiders out of webs. This is not for beginners. This is not for generalist species. It can go terribly wrong. So just bats, don't try this at home. Another reason that bats are awesome is that they're very, very good at hibernation. They are much better than bears. Bears only reduce their metabolism by 75%. Bats can reduce it by up to 98%. Also, they can duck in and out of mini hibernation, which we call torpor, to save energy and water and really short time intervals. Now, that's not all. There's still a little bit more. There are a few more reasons why bats are incredibly awesome, and they relate to what they do for us. So bats have been estimated by scientists that are not me, that they save agriculturalists $3.7 billion per year across the United States. And this is by eating pest insects, because bats can actually eat a huge amount. In fact, one paper and do you believe this, from a long time ago said that they could eat their own body weight. Yep, Pat's confirmed it. So they eat a lot of insects. Additionally, they are the pollinators for the agave plant, which produces tequila, also very important. And they transport huge amounts of energy between biomes. So we can see some bats up the top here. They're actually eating aquatic prey. So the dragonfly is an aquatic emergent insect, and you can see a frog over here. So they will be eating this aquatic energy and then transporting it, because they are so mobile, far into terrestrial ecosystems. Now, again, if you haven't eaten frogs before, it's probably a good idea to spend a couple of 1,000 years adapting before you try it, because it can be very tricky and it can go very, very wrong. Now, the final reason why bats are great for humans, has anyone had bat burritos? No. Bat burritos, anyone? Lovely, delicious? Bat burritos, I present. Now, this is the ecosystem service that is adorableness. Yep. All right. Okay, so I feel like I don't even need to ask. We're probably all on Team Bat now, so we can probably proceed to a little bit more information about bat ecology. So breaking down what bats need into two key categories, we can think about what they need at night, when they're active and when they're flying around, so when they're foraging or commuting and moving between foraging areas, and also when they're roosting during the day. So they may be resting, or during the maternity season, they'll need these roosts as well for nursing their young and for keeping their young when they're out foraging. So bats use a variety of different roosts, huge variety. So people often think about caves when they think about bats, and indeed they do roost in caves. And Pat, you were in a cave, yesterday? Looking for bats, is that right? They also roost in a wide variety of vegetative structures. So that can range from tree hollows to crevices to under-exfoliating bark. It's just bark that's sticking off the tree a little bit. Also even wrapped up in leaves or, very occasionally, in leaf litter. So they have a wide variety of roosts that they're adapted to. But in terms of foraging, let's talk a little bit about foraging. So how are they adapted to forage in different habitats? All of these diverse bats that we've been looking at. So here's a quick picture of all of the bats that you are likely to find in this region, like 17 different species that you are likely to find. And you can already see that they really look quite different to each other. So if we want to understand how these traits relate to the different environments that they can inhabit, this is a lot of information, so we're going to break it down and simplify it a little. I've put all of those bats onto a graph. So this graph has, on the y-axis, body mass, so the size of the bat. And so if you were a larger bat, then you can probably travel longer distances and fly more quickly. And on the x-axis, we have call frequency. So this is the general frequency of your call. And so if you have a higher frequency call, these are generally better for shorter distances and cluttered areas, and a lower frequency call that travels further will be better for more open areas. Now, there are a lot of other traits that are often correlated with these. So oftentimes, higher frequency calling bats will have a broader bandwidth call, which is also better for moving around in clutter. And larger bats with lower frequency calls will often have a longer duration, flatter call, so a narrower bandwidth, which is better at picking up little flips of beetle wings when you're out there in the open, foraging over large areas. So to give you a quick look at some of these bats, I'm going to show you this one up here in the top left, which is the Western Mastiff bat, which is the largest bat here. And I know some of you are looking at the sonogram and you're saying, look, that's not a very good quality sonogram. I'm sure she could have found a better one of the Mastiff bat. But the reason I'm showing you this one is because we recorded it at Devils Postpile just last summer. So it's quite exciting. So you can see the Western Mastiff bat call is very low frequency. It's down the bottom. There's a higher frequency calling bat above it, but it's very low frequency down the bottom. Some people, perhaps Emil and Micah, may even be able to hear this bat with their ears. And this bat it's very large. It needs really large areas of water bodies in order to come down and drink. And so it's really good at flying fast and flying in straight, open areas. Okay, so now if we look at another one that's slightly less extreme and a little bit more common, this is still a larger size bat. And if you have a look at its wings, it really shows it off in this photo. They have quite a long, narrow wing. And again, this is really good at flying in open areas. So this is a Mexican freetail bat. It's a big favourite of mine. I challenge people to go just about anywhere in California and hold up a bat detector and not record a Mexican freetail bat. So they are living under freeways in LA. These bats know how to adapt. They're really, really impressive. And you can see their sonogram here. Again, it's relatively low, and it's also quite flat and quite long duration. Again, that adaptation for an open environment. Now let's skip over down to the very bottom here where we have like a much higher call and a much smaller bat. So this is the adorable little California myotis. And if you look at its wings, you can see that they're a little broader, a little blockier, so better at maneuvering around at slower speeds. So better at navigating clutter. And again, you can see its calls are a lot higher in this sonogram, and they're much broader bandwidth. So that's helpful to characterise those cluttered landscapes. So if we put these 3 bats in the landscape, actually no, these are slightly different ones. We've got the Mexican free-tailed bat up the top. It's going to be flying in these open areas. We'd have our little myotis over here, which is going to be closer to some of the clutter, or at least able to navigate some of this clutter. And then over in the far left, we have a bat that's adapted to edges, so it has these intermediate traits. Okay, so that's your primer on bat adaptations to foraging habitat. Now we're going to speak briefly about fire ecology in the Sierra Nevada. Do we have any fire experts here? Any fire experts? Okay, great. Well, you're going to just believe everything I say. So we have these amazing fire-affected landscapes here, and a lot of the organisms are adapted really strongly to fire regimes. So you have these resistant organisms, like a lot of our conifers have this very thick fire-resistant bark, so they can resist burning. And then you have more of a resilient organism, like a manzanita over here, which can re-sprout out of these stores of energy. So immediately it burns all the way to the ground after fire, but it can re-sprout very quickly and recover quickly after fire. So we have these fire-adapted organisms. We live in a fire-adapted landscape that requires fire to reproduce. For example, I think over on the left here, we have a bunch of trees that are serotinous, so they require fire in order to open up their cones and release their seeds. So fire is a really, really important part of the environment. However, our fires in the West have been changing. So if we look over here at some great little visual that's come out recently, we can see over on the left-hand side is the historical fire condition in Western coniferous dry forests. So you see there's quite a large area. The y-axis is area, the x-axis is time. There's quite a large area of mature forest historically, and while there was fire, these would be more frequent and smaller and more mixed severity fire disturbances. That to some degree were also maintained by Indigenous fire stewardship that you can see in the top left, of folks who are maintaining fire mosaics to satisfy ecological and cultural needs. Now, after European colonisation, things changed a little, and there was an increase in logging, which reduced the amount of mature forest, and also an increase in fire suppression. So what we're seeing there is that these logged forests are growing back as even-aged stands, so not these nice mixed-aged, semi-open forest structures, growing back as even-aged stands and not able to self-thin because there aren't those low-severity fires coming through. So you get dense, even-aged forests that aren't able to grow as quickly and mature and that present a really big fire hazard. And then we see these big mega fires starting to happen in our western forests that we all know a lot about, right? And just quick visual on that one. This is a paper about megafires and about all the megafires that have been reported in the scientific literature and their location and size. And you all know where we live. It's in that big cluster of red dots up there. Yeah. So we're in a fire-adapted landscape, but it is changing, and that presents challenges for the biodiversity in this landscape, including bats. And especially for bats. We think about bats, a lot of their life is spent within vegetative structures, roosting in trees, and then foraging around trees for insects. So forests are really, really important for bats. So let's look at a little bit of research that I've been doing, finding out about how bats are responding to fire in these landscapes. So we're going to start out thinking about foraging, thinking about what they're doing at night. And I'm going to tell you first about a little bit of work from Plumas National Forest, which is just a little northwest of here. And so what we did here was we did a big acoustic survey. And you can see this is the boundary of Plumas National Forest here in the map. And the green map is, green is forest cover or canopy cover, and grey is open area. And the map over on the right, the red areas are areas that have burned since 1980, so quite a lot. And this is not even the Dixie Fire, this is pre. And so we use these bat detectors over here, Pedersen bat detectors, mounted on 3-metre poles. You can see someone popping out there in order to record bat calls. And like we were talking about before, bat calls are really diverse. And so you've got a really good shot at identifying them to species. And we have fantastic automated software made by another Californian bat scientist, Joe Suzak, that can help us do that, as well as, of course, the input of folks with experience identifying those bats to QA it. So yeah, we get a whole bunch of bat calls, so it's a way of passively monitoring the bats and finding out which species occur in an area. So we're interested in how the 17 bats of Plumas National Forest are using this landscape with reference to fire. And so we took all of the species that were there, we identified their different traits, and we tried to link those traits using a fourth corner analysis, or an RLQ analysis actually isn't what I'm going to show you, to these different burn and environmental variables. So I'm going to show you the result of that here. So it's like a little tricky initially, but what we see on the left is we see up the top in purple, we've got bat traits, right? So we've got the frequency of the call, the bandwidth of the call, the duration, body mass, and then 3 separate categories of bats, like phonic groups we put them into. Now down the bottom, we have in blue characteristics of the forest, so tree diameter, basal area, tree density, canopy cover, and in yellow, burn characteristics of the burned landscape. So the length of the bar and the direction of the bar indicates the correlation with these variables. So what you can see here is that the open adapted bats with the longer call durations and shorter bandwidths, for example, were more likely to be in areas with frequent fire and to a lesser extent higher burn severity. Whereas the bats that were adapted to clutter and that had a broader bandwidth call and higher call frequencies were less likely to be in those high burn severity and frequent fire areas and were more likely to be in areas where fire was rare. And so what this is telling us is that bats are adapted to different fire-affected landscapes. And therefore, a mosaic of burn conditions is probably going to be the best bet for maximising the number of bats that can live in one of these fire-prone landscapes. All right, so in order to look into this, we said, let's scale up. Okay, let's go from looking at these specific species and their traits to looking at actual bat richness, like how many bat species are in these different areas and how does the broader landscape affect them. So if we don't just look at the site, so what's the burn severity of that site, but we look at a broader area, a landscape buffer, can we see that these relationships will scale up? Can we see that there will be more bat species in areas with more diversity of habitats? So what we did was we related bat richness, you can see on the y-axis, to all of these variables, and I want you to pay close attention to a number of them here that represent the diversity of the burned landscape. So in the far right is diversity. This is the diversity of burn severity in the landscape. So it's just a standard deviation of the burn severity in the area around where we recorded those bats. And then over here as well, mean patch area is giving you an idea about how big those burn patches are. And then the others, you can see edge density, is an idea of how much edge there is, so how patchy, and then of course extent of burned area and patch density. So you can see that there was actually a positive relationship between bat species richness and diversity of burned areas, which was as we predicted, as well as, interestingly, a positive relationship with mean patch area and extent of burned area. So what this is telling us is that the more burned area, actually the more bat species there, which is super, super interesting and at first a little counterintuitive. You're like, well, we've had a lot of mega fires and I wouldn't expect the biodiversity to be responding positively to that. But one thing that we notice is that potentially because these bats are adapted to more frequent fires, these areas that have a lot of fire suppression are actually not indicative of their perfect habitat that they're adapted to. So we suspect that there's probably a threshold to this relationship with burned area, but at the moment, the bats are taking advantage of these more open areas within the forest. So let's relate this briefly to the rest of the world. And I was lucky enough to work with another bat great, Dr. Loeb, and work on a review of all of the studies of bats and fire that we could find across the globe. And so you can see over here, this is a map of the world with superimposed over the increase in fire weather days. So this is basically just giving you an idea about how many more fire weather days there are now compared to historically, okay? And so you can see over here, well, that's us over there, there are a lot of studies and there's also a lot of increase in fire risk. And what we found broadly, and I won't assault you with the very complicated figure I plan to include of space and time and variability, I will just give you a quick summary of what we found, which was that across all of these different areas, there was evidence that bats are highly resilient to fire. However, they were more likely to respond positively to fire when it was prescribed fire rather than wildfire. And so this is potentially because prescribed fire is generally lower severity than wildfire, and so more likely to mimic some of those historical conditions. The other thing we found was that there were very, very few studies of how fire affects bat roosting. So we know a bit about how they're foraging, how they're using that landscape that they're adapted to with their different traits, but where are they roosting in accordance to fire? Where are they roosting at all? This is a really huge knowledge gap. And so I'm going to give you a sneak peek into a fun study I'm working on with Dr. Doty, who is up at CSU Sacramento, and she's actually in the field in Sequoia National Park right now catching bats, which is pretty exciting. And she led this study looking at how bats are roosting in a fire-affected landscape in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. So this study, she captured bats in the area where there's a large circle. She captured them there, and they all roosted in those smaller circles. So, and what you can see is that paler area, that overlay, is actually the Castle Fire, which burned in 2020. And she conducted this study a year after that. Now, this burned area is actually quite heterogeneous. Like there are areas of high and low severity and some unburned areas. But what you can see is that all of the bats went that way. They all went into the burned area. I was asking Anna about this. I was like, well, is there some sort of giant mountain range there? Is there something stopping them from going up there? Is it a different elevation? And she didn't observe anything. We looked at a whole bunch of spatial layers. We couldn't find any other reason why they weren't going up. They were all going into the burned area. So something notable for starters. Now, I do want to hark back. So this is California myotis. We did see this bat before. What sort of environment would this bat be adapted to? Can anyone remember, or can you tell from the shape of its wing and the frequency and shape of its call? Clutter? Did I hear clutter? Yes, excellent. So this is a clutter-adapted bat. And as you'll recall from the acoustic studies, of all the bats, the ones that we were concerned about that may be less likely to respond positively to high-severity fire or frequent fire are the clutter-tolerant bats. So interesting to look at this species in terms of roosting. So let's have a quick look at what we found. Just to point out, the way she found these roosts was to capture the bats, place a little radio transmitter on them, and then to follow them around tirelessly with a receiver until she located the tree they were roosting in, and then she recorded it. And then they also recorded information about the nearest trees around, so that we could compare and get an idea about what they were actually choosing to roost in. So what we found was this. For starters, so you can see this is one of her pics on the left from the field. You might hopefully be able to see a little tiny California myotis in that bark. So found that they were selecting for exfoliating bark, and they were selecting for larger trees, so trees with a larger diameter at breast height. However, we didn't find any evidence that they were selecting burnt or unburnt trees at the tree scale. But when we brought that up to the area around the roost, we found that they were actually selecting for low severity burned areas. So I've got some examples here: high, medium, and low, high severity burned, low severity burned, and unburned. Does anyone have any ideas why you might roost in a low severity burned area versus an unburned area?
Still have some bark.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Diversity.
Better acoustics.
Better acoustics? Yes. Yeah, I like that. So better acoustics, so easier to navigate in and out of the roost. Excellent. Yeah, so it's definitely, if you look over there at the far left, again, thinking about the fire suppression that's happened in this landscape, we can have some areas that are quite dense, and it is quite difficult potentially to get in and out of your roost when you don't have that clear area to echolocate and to fly in. So could be one of the reasons. And another reason is potentially the conditions for torpor. So these bats were studied in the summer. We generally think about hibernation, we think about torpor in terms of winter, in terms of cold periods, when you want to shut down your metabolism and just chill out for a while until till you can go and eat things and be active again. However, bats actually use torpor, we're starting to learn, at a range of times, even during really hot, dry periods. And that's because they can use it not just to withstand like low resource periods, but also to save water and to save energy. So we're seeing them roosting in these low severity locations, which is matching up with some of the information that we're seeing about foraging. It's really interesting. One of the other cool things that Anna did in the field was attach little sensors to the bats so that she could measure their skin temperature and therefore see when they were going in and out of torpor in this environment. And so what we've got here is we have temperature on the y-axis and we have date on the x-axis. These are two individual bats that had a reasonably long period of torpor monitoring. And the black line here is the ambient temperature, whereas the magical rainbow line is the bat's skin temperature. Okay, it's rainbow because actually the only person who's not queer on the paper made it rainbow. So just FYI, it's not our fault. So it's rainbow because each of the days is, each of the colours is a different day, right? And you can see the bat's body temperature. So we're homeothermic, right? So our temperature can go up and down. How much, anyone medical in here? Like degree, less? Anyway, a small amount, right? Really small amount. Whereas these guys, you can see there are these drops of 10, 15 degrees in their body temperature. This is in the middle of summer. And so you can see the temperatures, the ambient temperatures there. So it was really fascinating that these bats were actually using torpor daily in this hot environment. And you can see as well, when the little magical rainbow lines are bumping up against the ambient temperature, that's evidence of them using passive rewarming. So instead of having to shake and metabolize and rewarm themselves and use energy, they're actually using that ambient temperature to allow them to rewarm and get ready for that night's foraging. Yes, Pat?
I assume they're males.
Oh, good question. They were, okay, so all of the bats in the study, sorry? Oh, the question was, Pat said, I assume they're males, right? So all of the bats in this study were either male or they were post-lactation females. But I'm not actually sure which ones these are. Yeah, so, but all of them were post-lactation females, so they may have been males. I'll double check on that one for you and we'll discuss later. Oh yeah, so the significance being that, so during lactation, females have a lot higher energy requirements, and so they might be more likely to go into torpor. Is that your understanding? No. Oh, okay. All right. Wait a minute. Okay.
They can't afford to go into torpor. They have to maintain high temperature.
All right. So Pat has just clarified. In fact, if these were lactating females and if they were going back to their babies to their maternity colony, then they wouldn't have the luxury of going into torpor because they need to maintain that body temperature in order to keep their young warm, right? Which is one of her research studies. It's cool. All right, excellent. And so a sneak peek here at some torpor data from a fire-affected landscape, hot off the press. And so what we're getting from this, in terms of the future for bat communities in the Sierra Nevada, is that we're seeing that bats are resilient to fire in terms of their foraging, but also at least this one clutter-tolerant species in terms of its roosting in low-severity fire landscapes, at least. And so they may experience benefits from prescribed fire, which is generally low severity, especially if it's applied heterogeneously, as well as Indigenous fire stewardship. So leaving it with that, prescribed fire, Indigenous fire stewardship, low severity fire is probably a good idea, variability in fire is probably a good idea. We're going to do a quick meet and greet with the local bats. So I threw this one up earlier, but I mentioned, or I think Carol may have mentioned, I was at Devils Postpile last summer with Monica Bueller and the lovely folks there at Devils Postpile because they were interested in updating a study that actually Bill did. It did an amazing couple of surveys of bats in the park, and they wanted to see what all the latest acoustic gadgets could get and whether we could get some more species onto that list. So here are the 17 potential bat species of the park, and we recorded 15 out of those, which was really, really exciting. So the ones for the bat gurus, the ones we didn't get, was the Townsend's bat and weirdly the Canyon bat. Here are just a couple of graphs of what we found in terms of bat species richness and activity at Devils Postpile. So this is just a view of that gorgeous meadow, really, really beautiful meadow in the park. And that actually had the highest bat species richness, with 14 bats recorded just in that site over a 1-week period. And then the highest bat activity actually came just outside the park at Red's Meadow, which I'm sure a lot of you know, where there was an extremely high bat activity, but may also have been related to some of the artificial lights there that were attracting bats in. But there was overall a pretty high diversity across the park. So you'll see over on the left-hand side of this graph here, it says high, moderate, low. And that's just because we were interested in looking at how the different sections of the park that have been affected by blowover and by fire were doing with bat diversity, so that the park could manage those areas accordingly for fire prevention. And we found that there wasn't a great deal of variability among those different types. And so here are a couple of here are some of the bats that we recorded, the new bats that we recorded, along with a couple that were Forest Service sensitive species. And so we're hoping that we might be able to pop back and do some bat captures and learn more about these bats and where they're actually roosting. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone for coming along, and also to thank my field crew and folks that have helped out with some of these different projects, and invite a whole bunch of diverse questions. Thank you.
So we can take questions here, and for our Zoom people, we'll pass the microphone around so our Zoom folks can hear the questions too. And then we usually get quite a few questions on Zoom. So if you out there on Zoom have a question, you can type it into the Q&A area. But anyone?
All right.
All right, Tom.
It's about that paper.
Oh, stop.
No, I have two questions. One, I grew up in Colorado in a place where there weren't very many trees, but we encountered bats a lot when we were rock climbing. And it's always been in my head somehow that their roosts were simply in the rock faces and no place else. So I'm wondering what the proportions are between rocks and vegetation for, say, in the Sierra, the roosting. Do you know? Is it possible to know?
Well, if I don't know, then these guys are going to know. So I'm going to wander away.
Okay,
So I know.
Real quick, then I've got a second question.
Yeah, okay.
Which is, in the moderate burn severity, the trees themselves still are hydrated. How much of the moisture in the vegetation, which can moderate then the daytime temperatures, has to do with their attraction there?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. Oh, that's cool. You can hold it for now. Okay, so I'll do the second one first, and the first one. So the second one's really interesting. So you're asking about the moisture in the tree and how that affects that microclimate for the roost, right? Yeah, I think that's something that probably hasn't been explored a great deal. People are starting to put little eye buttons into roosts and to try and understand the humidity and the temperature of their microclimates. But in terms of the actual cooling effects of moisture in trees that have been burned to different extents, I think that's still pretty fresh. Anything you know about that area, Brains Trust? But the rock crevices, yeah. So the rock crevices is, yes, spot on. So I know the canyon bat loves to roost in rock crevices. And what other bats would be in rock crevices in Colorado, do you reckon?
Oh, mastiffs don't get that far, but mastiffs are classically in rock or
Nice. Oh, actually, so can I grab the... Yes. Just going to pass this to Bill. There we go.
Yeah, well, and spotted bats are classically hard rock. When you get to big browns and some of the sort of mid-sized aerial attack predators, it can easily, they're present in both, and it's just a question of local convenience.
Aerial attack predators.
Don't you love that? Excellent. Thank you, Bill and Pat.
I wondered, with the years of drought that we had and now suddenly 300% year of snow and stuff, how is that expected to affect bat species? I just took a hike out by Crawley Lake and there were grasshoppers or locusts everywhere. So I'm just wondering, was there a big population dip and now you expect it to explode, or for bats?
Oh, there's so much in that question. Really good question. Yeah, so number one, it is hard to get a handle on bat populations and what they're doing. And we're lucky in that we do have a program, the NA Bat program, which is a North American bat monitoring program based largely on acoustics, but also including roost counts, that is trying to get a handle on the overall trends of populations. But that's still being rolled out to different areas. So, but the short answer is we don't know for sure. We can't say for sure, like, oh yeah, the bat populations were really high this year, or the abundance was great. You've got something to add? No? But definitely that kind of increase in productivity of so a lot of water around, a lot of productivity around, a lot of insect activity around is going to be great for bats. And I think another really interesting part of this is the interaction between fire and water. So there was a really great study done about the fire pulse, which was where there was a high severity burned area. And then a few years afterwards, there was a big flood that rushed all of these nutrients down into the riparian zones. And afterwards, there was a huge pulse of aquatic productivity that attracted all of the predators, bats, birds, etc., to these areas. And so it ended up being a really interesting interaction between fire and then this large availability of water. But yeah, Pat, did you have something to add? Can I grab the mic again? We may as well just leave it over there.
One of the other things that you should appreciate about bats is that for their body size, they're very long-lived. They've been banded and recaptured after 43 years. And so they are not rodents. And with this goes the fact, and they only have one baby a year, so they don't respond like rodents or other animals might to pulses of more insects or whatever they're eating in the environment. During the drought, they stop reproducing. A lot of the females don't have babies. They're smarter than humans. But anyway, I mean, that's I shouldn't say that. But anyways, but so the thing is, you're not going to see an increase in bat populations. They probably will all breed this year. Now, will they breed in subsequent years? So we're finding that the bats are not, overall, bat populations, because I do lots and lots of roost counts, and they're just plain old declining almost everywhere.
Well, and I love that you have bat socks, too. Here you go, Greg.
Thanks, Carol. I have two questions, but the first question I was going to ask you, I mentioned to my neighbor that I was coming to this talk tonight, and she said, "Oh, I love bats, they're wonderful." She would have raised her hand right away. She said that she grew up over near Yosemite on the western side of the Sierra. So she said we had a lot of bats where I was growing up. So I wondered, of the 15 species, this is question number one, of the 15 species, what's their range? Would she have seen the same bats, many of the same bats over there, say Oakdale or whatever?
Yeah, so there's 17 species. So the 15 are the ones that we recorded so far in Devils Postpile, so just down the road. But the 17 species are the ones that we would tend to record in the SierraNevada region. And so, yeah, for sure. I think the thing about bats, like they are super mobile. There are definitely areas, there are like sort of higher elevation adapted bats, and there are ones that you're more likely to get in those lower elevation areas. But yeah, she could well be seeing very similar or but experiencing being near these similar species for sure, and seeing some of them definitely.
I'll tell her that when I see her later.
Yeah.
So the other question was sparked by what Pat, I guess it is, just said about the long lifespan of bats. And there are a couple of aspects of that that I really am puzzled about, because they're small and they presumably have fairly high metabolism, and small animals. So lifespan has been correlated in many mammals, including humans, with caloric restriction. The more calories you eat, the faster your metabolism and the shorter your lifespan. So I was wondering if maybe the fact that the bats go into torpor has some sort of an effect on their overall gross metabolic rate that's maybe mitigating the effects or against the what would cause them to age faster because of a high metabolic rate.
That's my understanding, yeah, that it's the use of torpor that allows them, but I think Pat's got something more to add.
You're correct in that. The bats that have been banded in Europe that live, in colder areas are the ones that are the 43-year-old bats. Also up in Canada, I met a 34-year-old bat up there. But what I've studied a bat that's a tropical species. A lot of bats in the world don't have the ability to lower body temperature and go torpor. They may have a little bit of dip in body temperature, but basically they're maintaining high body temperatures all the time. And so California leaf-nosed bats, which I've been studying for 50-some years right now, we've banded and recaptured bats up to 15 years old. So it's not all about body temperature. Bats have something else going on, too. Bill, go ahead.
Well, there are a range of physiologically and biochemically unique features about bats, or distinctive at least. For instance, most of us have read something or other in the popular literature about telomere loss on the chromosomes being correlated with and perhaps having a role in aging and ultimately mortality. That pretty much doesn't occur in bats. And there are they have quite a remarkable immune system, which has been popularized maybe in not legitimate ways since the events that led to COVID. They're able to tolerate remarkable assemblages of viruses in their bodies that are not doing them any harm, no inflammation. There are a vast array of things we don't understand about bat physiology, but we're sort of beginning to get some hints, mostly from molecular work, a lot of which is being done in Europe.
Awesome. Thank you, Pat and Bill. Dr. Pat and Dr. Bill.
In the back here.
I'm curious if you would expect to see similar relationships with the way bats respond to these low severity fires with something like mechanical thinning, or if there's anything fundamentally different between those two things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, I've done a bit of work with the Forest Service, both in Australia and over here, looking at mechanical thinning. And I wanted to clarify as well, because I know we all, most of us here probably feel uncomfortable about the idea of cutting down trees. I'm just going to make a guess about the crowd. But I think in a lot of these areas where mechanical thinning is used from a conservation perspective, it's when we have a situation where there are a bunch of even-aged trees. They're in a kind of resource lock, where they're not able to grow as quickly as they need to. You don't have this ability to have a large old tree and then a bunch of other different age trees. And so oftentimes mechanical thinning is used to produce those historical, more open structures. And so I was in a situation during my PhD in Australia where I was working with the Forest Service and the National Park Service on 2 adjacent national parks, and they were both using mechanical thinning, but for, quite sort of different mixed reasons. But yeah, so I think the research has shown so far, in terms of bat foraging at least, that mechanical thinning and prescribed burning can have similar effects. But I think there's a lot more work to be done there. I think there are definitely, like talking about the fire pulse with the variability in those nutrient fluxes. That's something that obviously fire can stimulate a lot of growth. It can stimulate reproduction in a lot of plants. That's going to have an effect on insects. That's going to have an effect on bats. So, and it's a different kind of disturbance. And there's also a lot of variability in how folks do thinning. Do they leave the logs there, or do they take them out, etc.? So I think prescribed burning is probably going to mimic the natural disturbance in the best way, but thinning is definitely an option that can work when you have a landscape that is too dense to be used for foraging by bats. But yeah, but with roosting, it's a little bit more of a mixed story. Yes, Pat. What? Oh, wait, the mic's coming your way.
And we do have, and I'll try to get some of the Zoom questions here.
Yeah.
Was there, coincidentally, anyone doing insect captures or studies during this period? Because so much of the bark beetles and all, which occur after fires. So it would be good to say, why is just a moderate burn better than dense forests? But I mean, it's all about food, ultimately.
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really good point. So I often, as someone who's very involved in vegetation structure, I often come from the it's all about structure point of view. So I remember I did my PhD, we looked at thinning, etc., and we caught so many insects, and I identified all of them to order at least, and it took my whole 3 years to do it, and there was absolutely no effect. I was like, okay, all right, insects, no, it's not about insects. It's about structure. It's about how they can fly through and echolocate and access them. It's mustn't be about insects at all. But of course, it is about all of these things. But I think that's a really important thing that we do need to do, because there is so much complexity. Like you say, there are bark beetles that come out after fire that are very delicious. There are these pulses of aquatic insects that emerge and move out into the rest of the landscape. There are a whole bunch of early successional fire plants that are going to attract insects as well. So I think we do definitely need to be looking at these whole of ecosystem questions for sure, Pat. Yeah. And Bill?
One Australian-linked one was a recent science paper that essentially argued that through atmospheric mechanisms, the major brush burns that have dominated eastern Australia, that the smoke from those was directly linked to changing the La Nina cycle and played a role in being responsible for the drought in Western North America.
Oh my God, can you pass it to Tom? Do you have any comments?
Speak up.
The processes are there, but whether that's the case, I don't know.
Interesting, yeah.
Maybe we got a couple of folks on Zoom. We could take a question or two there. I think I see David has a couple of questions there.
Okay, excellent. Hi, David. Okay, so any connection between species richness of bat populations and possible diversity/size of arthropod prey populations in the post-fire areas, which Pat was also interested in. So I think we have, we've touched on that, is that unfortunately we don't have that data yet, but it is very important data to get and very interesting. Your second question was about white nose syndrome and whether it was something that we observed during any of these studies. So the studies in Plumas and in Devils Postpile were acoustic, so we did not capture any bats. Therefore, we couldn't observe white nose syndrome. Anna, with the roost study, has not observed any white nose syndrome. I would like to again check in with Pat and Bill and see if they have any kind of updates or your own observations in the field in terms of. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so white nose syndrome is a fungal disease that has decimated bat populations over on the east side of the US. So we suspect that it came out of Europe. But the bats there was even evidence for a kind of bottleneck in populations. I'm not sure exactly when, but a long time ago in Europe, when potentially white nose was reduced those populations, they adapted to it, and then they bounced back, and so now they live with it. What it is, it's like a little fungus that it appears as white on their nose, and it can cause them to stir during their hibernation and use up energy, and also dehydrate them. They need to go and drink, and they can run out of energy and die. And so white nose syndrome caused population declines of upwards of 90% in some species. Some of the most common bats in the eastern US were really decimated. And over in the west, we have recorded, white nose has been recorded over here in various locations, but we have not seen the same population declines. Also, we don't necessarily have the same roosting situations where we have giant hibernacula of the same species all in one spot that can then pass on this disease to each other and have mass die-offs. But also there is a lot we don't know. We have occasional superheroes that go and study bat roosts for decades and can tell us things about those populations, but we don't have a handle on a lot of the species in terms of where they're roosting and how their populations are doing there. So, Pat and Bill, did you have anything to say? Did you have any updates on white nose or things to add or?
So what California Department of Fish and Wildlife does and is sponsoring other scientists to do is to go out and swab for the fungus. So even if the bat doesn't have overt signs of it, it growing actively, and of course that happens in hibernation, and the ones that are severely affected die where they're hibernating. So they have found the fungus. They have not found the disease in the bats in California. That said, we know very little about where the same types of species that are really getting hit in the east, the myotis, the little brown bats, are hibernating. They're in the Sierras. They come out. We're studying several populations on the east side. The numbers are dropping. Whether or not that is due to bats dying in some unknown place in the mountains, we don't know. I mean, there's a lot of other stressors going on, so we don't know what exactly the culprit is, but right after they come out of hibernation, they still, if they were roosting in a roost with spores, they might be carrying it. So that's why this capturing bats we just went out in May with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to do that.
Excellent, thank you, Pat.
Well, I think maybe we should let Rachel go. We could talk bats all night here, I'm sure, and I'm sure she would be happy to entertain any questions if you want to walk up. Grayson, I'll give you one last question. Last question goes to Grayson.
how do you become an amateur batter out here? I would like to, no, seriously, I would like to identify bats in the neighborhood, and how do you go about that?
Okay, so the first thing you do is grab a little cup of tea and make friends with Pat and Bill here. But no, there are, you guys are definitely the people of this region, but there are bat clubs. There's a Southern California bat group, and that we have a lot of people involved. People that work on bats, but people that are just really interested in bats or doing outreach about bats. So there are various bat working groups. We occasionally have you as a celebrity guest. We have you guys as celebrity guests at SoCal Bat Group because you have your SoCal connections. But I'm trying to think what the nearest one. There isn't one around here.
Also, I don't want to join a club.
You don't want to join a club?
Grayson, didn't you take the Bats Are Beautiful camp at Valentine when you were little? so you're on your way already. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say in terms of sort of for bird watching, where you get binoculars and you kind of get to know the animals that way. They do have really inexpensive bat detectors now. Good software. All you need is an iPhone or an Android, and you can put a microphone on that, download software, and for less than a couple $100, you can go out, and it'll also show you pictures of your bat and all this sort of thing.
I actually had a second question. I just didn't want to. How are experts QA for the semi-automated bat detection? If the frequency is outside of your normal hearing, how are you?
Oh, good one. Yeah, so the sonograms that we were looking at before. So what you get, you'll get a bunch of WAV files from your bat recorder, and then you'll be able to pop them on your computer and look at that sonogram. And so what you look at are a number of things to do with the shape of the call, the frequency of the call, and it is really tricky because there's a lot of overlap among bats. And there's also variability. If you're a bat and you're flying around and you're flying in an open area, you're going to call a little bit differently than when you're flying in a cluttered area. Or if you're catching an insect or drinking, you're going to call a little differently as well. So there's a lot of nuance to it. And so what it tends to come down to is a good enough quality call to be able to make the call on it. So some species, you need a really good quality call to be I'm confident. Other species, it's more oh, wow, there's no one else at that frequency. Okay, yeah. So, but yeah, Pat's absolutely right. I've got one I can show you. I don't think I have it on me today, but at some point, and it's great. You've got a little plug into your phone, and you show up on your screen, and it pops up with a picture of the bat. It can be a little iffy with the ID, just so don't take it as gospel. But that is definitely the best tool for amateur bat fun times for sure. And it's a great cocktail party show off thing as well. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rachel.
And thank you. I'd also like to thank my expert panel, Pat and Bill and Tom. Let me see. I think people were just very excited about who you guys were, and it's been answered in the chat. So, yeah, here we go. Who was it? Okay, great.
That was great.
Thanks. That was really fun. Let me turn this off.